On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Brian Jackson. He is the Manager of DevOps Engineering at Lucasfilm. We're going to be talking about the challenges in growing and expanding the team. Brian's responsible for DevOps Engineering. I think he has some nuances as to what he's going through to expand the team and some of the challenges, and going to kind of pick his brain in terms of what he's doing and what he's seeing, and super excited to have him on the podcast. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for having me here. And for your listeners who might not be familiar with Lucasfilm, we are the stewards of Star Wars. And my role specifically is with the Advanced Development Group, where we focus on real-time innovation in real-time rendering. And then ILM Lab, which is our game studio that is focused on story living through immersive entertainment, things like virtual reality and augmented reality.
Awesome.
Yeah. And my role specifically is around DevOps engineering, which really is for us build, release, and deployment systems, kind of everything from an artist workstation through to our digital retail stores. So getting stuff out to our consumers while also improving the quality of life for our artists and engineers.
So I guess we got to thank you for getting all the shows and all the apps and all that stuff live, because I'm sure lots of people out there probably have touched at some point a Lucasfilm product. And I guess we could diverge and talk about all that stuff. And I would not to any ends be unhappy about that. But I want to talk about the podcast episode and stay on point here. So I guess at the highest level, I always like to set the context of understanding what your team looks like. Now, obviously, you're trying to grow and expand the team, but maybe at the highest level, what does your team look like in terms of the people responsible for actually delivering that build, release, deployment?
Yeah. So we're a small team right now. So there's 5 of us right now, if you include myself, Emily, Pat, John, and Nadia. And we're focused on, we've got kind of the range of senior to kind of just out of college and just into the industry, and even within our small team. And so we focus a lot on productivity engineering, improving the productivity of our team through CI and tools also built into like the Unreal editor, because the artists and engineers are working in Unreal. So we fit into a lot of different places in that ecosystem. And we're just trying to find the best place to help folks. But a lot of it is like Team City Engineering, which is, for those not familiar, is a competitor to Jenkins for CI. We have Perforce for source control, as well as like GitHub and GitLab. And our team is focused around both administering some of those tools, as well as building infrastructure that is like push button self-service infrastructure for the artists and engineers that are part of ILM Lab and ILM's virtual art department.
Awesome. And I guess as you're kind of, trying to expand the team and you're looking at, growing skill sets, and I guess there's got to be a balance of adding headcount, growing internal resources. You mentioned somebody was a little bit more junior on the team. When you're kind of forecasting out and you're trying to think ahead in terms of, some of what you're trying to accomplish, how much of your plan is, based on what you're seeing with the staff development versus, hey, I know I'm going to need, some kind of skills down the road that kind of fit these particular niche roles or whatnot. Like, are you looking at the current team and going, hey, how am I going to grow skills versus, hey, we know we need this outside expertise and I'm going to have to hire for it at some point?
Yeah, I would say it's all of the above. So with our small team, it's about growth, internal growth, both career development for the folks who are on my team, as well as if there are parts that are missing, how do we fill that gap? And it can be internally, how do we work with teams at Disney, which is our parent company, or we work with other teams at ILM to either shift, and so say, hey, you know what, somebody in another team is a real strong expert. Let's partner with them on that, versus then raising up to my management, because I'm a line level manager, that, hey, we really do need to fill in test automation gap. We need more headcount because we've got too many projects that we're trying to support.
Awesome. How do you go about, I'm just curious, because obviously you mentioned, some of the other teams that you could possibly leverage for their expertise. How do you know who's on those teams? How do you keep track of them? I mean, there's got to be plenty of other people doing similar things to be able to find those type of skills in other areas.
Yeah, the Walt Disney Company is a huge company. And so I am lucky that I have been here. I took a sabbatical, as I call it, at Apple for just over a year. But in total, I've been at the Walt Disney Company in different business units for, I think, 14, almost 15 years now in total. And so it's a mix of making connections when you have that longevity at a company. Is like, I literally am now working with people I worked with 14 years ago because of just small world, small industry, and small company, even though it's huge. As well as, I mean, I think anybody has that question of like, hey, this is such a big company. There must be somebody who's already doing this. And then looking at the internal directory or asking other folks that you do know, like, hey, do you know somebody who works in this space? So it's really about trying to organically find those connections and that expertise internally. And then like going to conferences, like that's the other part, like just going to like industry events. I've met other people at my company through those events.
I'd imagine. I was actually thinking, obviously, you guys are a behemoth company and finding that skill is almost a recruiting job on its own internally, I'd assume, because there is a definite need for what you're doing across the company and everyone is doing different versions of it. And all of a sudden to find a person to fill the gap in, it's almost like tapping internal talent acquisition to come help with that search would be really nice.
Yeah. And whether it's through a partnership or for us right now too, it's such a niche that we're trying to fill when it comes to new recruiting, because it's somebody who has a passion about, build engineering and automation and systems infrastructure and cloud engineering, while also being a programmer and understanding operational concerns, and then being focused on game development or VFX. You're just adding filter upon filter. So we're a big company, but we don't get a lot of resumes for like when we have an open head, I think because of that niche filter.
I guess just a question there is like when you're trying to balance, looking for somebody to join your team, and obviously there are, like you mentioned, some niche factors in the person that could fit and excel, right out the gate versus needing some ramp up time. Are you in the back of your mind thinking I might be willing to give up some of these for some of those skills? Is that a trade-off that's always balancing in your head?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, even just in our most recent, we have an open position at the moment is, we don't have like all of the background of my team are folks who are coming not from the game industry and not having that background, say, directly with a game engine. And so we're all learning, and I've been learning for the last, 5-6 years. So I really wanted to find somebody who was from within the game industry. And again, we're just not getting a lot of resumes through the pipeline. And so starting to let go of that particular filter is something that I'm okay with, because I can see from my team, we're all able to, for instance, learn that tech stack. And so deciding which part of the tech stack we want to let go of. And maybe it's, instead of letting go of that, it's saying, somebody who doesn't have as much experience with cloud engineering, right? And finding that balance and striking that balance is a portion of what I'm trying to learn and figure out, and hopeful that I'm not getting it wrong. But, only time will tell.
Absolutely. From a technical perspective, when someone is joining, right, and let's say they don't have that particular component to their skill, which not everyone would, but also there's other areas within your industry that most people are not just exposed to. What kind of ramp up time is it? Like, I mean, to go from joining, somebody who would be able to, be functionally effective to actually being instrumental to pick up all these sub tech stacks.
Anybody who's joined the team, I've told them it's a minimum of a year before you're going to feel comfortable. And then realistically, it's like 2 or 3 years before you're like kind of a subject matter expert on any given piece of it. But that first year you're not producing anything and not getting anything done. It's a few weeks before you're kind of getting, your hands into something that's gone into production. And then, a few months before you're like, hey, people are coming to me to find out how that thing works. But it's a year. It's a good year before you're like, okay, I think I know what I'm doing. So that's what it was for me.
Nice. And I guess from like when you're looking at that year in terms of like the technical nuance of what you're doing, I mean, is there any obstacles that you go, well, to be productive here, there's some technical skills you have to come in with, otherwise it's just difficult to close the gap?
Yeah, I think, and this is the balance that I'm trying to strike, is how much of a software engineering background do you have to have versus somebody who's just been, focused on operations. Mm-hmm. And I'm finding more and more with tools like Terraform and Ansible, having the software engineering foundations of like object-oriented structuring and things like that go a long way. And those are some of the things that I'm starting to realize I shouldn't, when we're talking striking the balance, those are some of the fundamentals of like, if somebody has that background in programming, whether through formal education or just through experience, I feel like somebody could excel in these roles if they're interested in, like I said, cloud engineering and infrastructure engineering versus build and release pipeline engineering.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it seems more and more, whether it's the DevOps side or data engineering, that software engineering background is becoming a key, because even on the data engineering side, you're seeing that you have to write more code than you ever did before. And now the ops side is having that same requirements, but a bit of a pressure on finding people that are, automation minded, operations minded, but also can write pretty good code. And I guess when you're looking at that skill set, would you completely abandon the operations side? Say, hey, listen, I'd much rather bring a software engineer and train them on the ops side, or do you need a little bit of that, experience, or at least, baseline of operations to know that they fit the mentality of what the role needs to be?
I definitely look for somebody who at least has a proclivity to having, that kind of mindset of, we need to have proper logging and we need to understand how to troubleshoot a production problem, quote unquote. And so I wouldn't say I abandon it, maybe the experience in saying like somebody has to have that experience, but part of like our technical skills evaluation is going to be around how does somebody kind of fit both the software engineering and that operations mindset from both sides of that perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think most companies that we're seeing also would prefer that software engineering background, but it seems very difficult for a company just to take a pure software engineer and make that shift into an ops role without some of that baseline. And I guess when you're describing it, obviously would be similar. But I guess as time goes by and depending on how long you're waiting to hire, and I guess this becomes the tricky question, is as time keeps going on, how much of that flexibility shifts? Like, where do you start trading off? Because DevOps roles could take, you could get lucky and fill it in a month. It could take 6 months. And I wouldn't even go, maybe a year. Depending on the nuance of the role.
Yeah, our current opening, I think we're at like 4 months right now.
Yep.
But I have gotten lucky where I've had somebody in, a month or two. It is very difficult. And it does become that like, where do I start letting go of making things preferred instead of required when it comes to that skill set and that requirements. But that's where I lean on either other people internally to our organization or other parts, our partners in Disney, because say we hire somebody who has that gap in knowledge, it's making sure I'm introducing them to those people so that they can hopefully, through experiencing, either it's a daily stand-up or working hands-on with somebody who has that experience, they can hopefully absorb that and learn from it.
I was going to ask you a question about, obviously, it is cool on the backdrop to your video screen right now is a ton of Star Wars stuff, which a lot of technologists like, not all, but a lot do. And I love Star Wars. And I guess the question is going through the pandemic and having moved to remote hiring, that might have been a disadvantage for you growing your team, because obviously I'm sure somebody, coming on site, seeing all the Star Wars stuff has got to be a great selling advantage, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. And I think that's, I don't want to speak for our recruiting team, but I know that's definitely been part of the struggle, because it is a really big selling point to be, on campus and be a part of Lucasfilm headquarters. I can speak from personal experience. I actually went remote before the pandemic. And so I was on site at headquarters for a year and lived out my dream. And it was a wonderful experience. And then I wanted to move home and come back to being closer to family and friends. And everybody was very supportive and allowed that to happen. So for the past 4 years, I've been remote, and my team has grown to be a distributed team. And so it's been a really great balance, but it's hard to say that an entire, whether it's a game studio or VFX studio, is able to run like that. Time will tell. But the pandemic definitely threw a big loop into just how things are produced. And kudos to our IT team at Lucasfilm for supporting us and allowing an entire company to suddenly go remote. I'm sure that's a story that many companies went through in March of 2020.
Yeah, I was covering that as a topic with a couple of people back at the peak of the pandemic, and it was an interesting conversation, and different challenge altogether. And I guess when you're kind of now thinking about going back to your team and growing it out, and you guys are remote. Obviously, if you were to think through, let's say, hiring someone completely remote and, later on the office is available, how do you kind of balance that? Because I'm sure some people will be like, hey, I'm remote, but I'm out here, 1,000 miles away. I'd like to come back. Do you think it'll be a hybrid where people will have choices to come and go? Have you guys, thought about those?
Definitely.
Things?
Definitely. And that is my personal expectations. I can't speak for, the company. But if somebody on my team is like, I think I want to relocate to San Francisco to be at headquarters, I would be 100% supportive of it. And, I would talk with management and everybody to see if that's a possibility.
Very cool. How flexible does your team have to be as, you guys are in a very, large brand-based entity, lots of demand for product. And obviously you guys know when things go live. How much of your hiring roadmap has to take in consideration what the actual business is doing and what's coming in terms of releases and whatnot?
It's a factor. It's hard because as far as just knowing what that roadmap is, and then, with a large company, you've got lots of people who sign off on headcount. And so it's hard to get those things to perfectly match or to be, a single stream of consciousness. But, so for us, it's really just about kind of the immediate growth and what we see and what's kind of tangible. And so really, when it comes down to it, I'm pitching on, hey, this is the past, say, 6 months of what we've been trying to do, and we need more headcount, right? Versus I have this perfect vision of what the roadmap is for the business, and we need to grow to it. Just trying to strike a balance because it's a guessing game for a lot of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it certainly sounds like you definitely kept busy. I guess out of curiosity, in case someone it's a niche, so I don't know how lucky we'll get, but we can try. What is the ideal person? Like if you're like, hey, I'd hire this person tomorrow, what does that person look like?
Yeah, for me, it's probably somebody who's somehow worked on a pipeline for Unreal Engine, because that's a lot of what we're supporting today for the products that we're pushing out. Somebody who's worked on that build pipeline. And whether it's another game studio or, virtual production is really a growing industry right now as well. Made famously by a lot of the work that was done on the first season of The Mandalorian. And so I think whether it's somebody in one of those two industries who's already been a part of how do you build and release either the engine itself, because we have a internal fork that we maintain, or it's the building projects for the Unreal Engine. Just those sentences kind of encapsulates a lot of different technologies. And that's it. A lot of these candidates will have to have that breadth or learn that breadth of knowledge of lots of different technologies, whether it's C++ or for us, Kotlin with Team City, or Python or Bash scripting or PowerShell, because a lot of what we're doing is on Windows. So the perfect candidate would have all of those things magically.
How does, being a Windows environment, how does that make it, more complicated? Does it make it more complicated, or that's just the environment you deal with it?
Yeah, it's a challenge in the sense that it's a different operating system. So, having folks internally who we might not be able to lean on, because ILM and a lot of Lucasfilm is very focused on Linux and Linux desktop and Linux servers. So, we've got a lot of learning that we did on how do you manage and operate Windows from kind of a server build farm perspective, as well as from, pushing bits and bytes around when it comes to like perforce and source control. And so a lot of our learning was around Ansible and Chocolatey. Chocolatey is an amazing package manager, very similar to Yum or apt-get on the Linux side of things, or Homebrew on the Mac OS side of things. And building an ecosystem around a different set of tools is really the challenge, that it's a different stack of technology.
Absolutely. Have you seen success or not seen success for people coming from, non-Windows and picking up, the complementary tools in the Windows environment?
If you're interested in it, because I think there can be, great religious wars fought between Mac, Linux, and Windows. And so one of the things I personally had to go through in my career was letting go of if there's kind of a disdain or there's a concern about oh, I'm a Mac guy, so I don't like, having to support Windows. Once I personally was able to let go of those things, it really improved. And it made me realize just how rich the ecosystem is, whether it's Windows or Linux or supporting Mac OS. And so I think if you have the ability to get over any of those mental hurdles, the technology is very robust and rich in there. It's about learning the tech than it is necessarily that the tech isn't there, for instance.
Awesome. I mean, it sounds like a cool place to to work. First of all, I think everyone would agree with that. And obviously, if someone's listened and is a fit, I mean, reach out to Brian in some form or fashion, because I'm sure there's a good opportunity there. If somebody does want to reach out to you, just to kind of pick your brain or wants to apply to your team, is LinkedIn a good way of getting a hold of you? Is there a preferred way?
Yeah, LinkedIn, and I'm also very active on Twitter. So those are two social networks that I definitely would encourage folks to reach out to me on.
Okay, awesome. We'll include those in the show notes. And yeah, if somebody does listen to anything that they want to follow up with Brian, let him know. Brian, thanks for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, I always ask for two things. One, if the podcast is interesting, keep sharing it. That's how we've been growing. We don't advertise, so it's all been just organic sharing of the podcast. So I appreciate everyone who does that. And if there's a topic you want me to talk about, feel free to get a hold of me on LinkedIn. Let me know, and I'll do my best to find a guest. Until next time, goodbye.